What is going on, chess YouTube? So, Tata Steel has just wrapped up, and with that in mind, in today's video, we are looking at one of Magnus Carlsen's latest and greatest games. It is Magnus versus the Indian superstar Arjun Erigaisi from the 2024 Tata Steel India Tournament. And here we go. In the game, Arjun is playing as white. He opens 1d4. Magnus goes knight to f6, the Indian defense, very appropriate. Now we have c4 and e6. And now here, Arjun, of course, the late options are knight to c3, knight f3, and g3. Now in the game, he does go knight to c3, allowing the Nimzo-Indian Defense from black. That is the main line. But here, Magnus, he does not go for it. Instead, he does play the move d5. The queen's gambit declined. A very interesting choice. Now here, going d5 in this position after knight to c3 instead of after knight to f3 does allow a very good version of the exchange variation of the QGD. And here, that is what Arjun goes for. So, c takes d5, then e takes, and then bishop g5. This is the main line. And here, white is thought to have at least a very slight advantage, although black is very solid. Now here, Magnus, he starts c6, bolstering d5. Of course, there were threats based on knight takes d5, based on that knight on f6 being pinned, so c6 is the standard idea. Now here, Arjun, e3. Again, very standard for white, the idea being you get that dark square bishop outside the pawn chain, then go e3, intending ideas like bishop d3, queen c2, knight to f3 or e2, and then short castles or even castling on the queen side. Now here, Magnus, in this position, the main line for him is going to be something like bishop e7. That is the standard idea here for black. But instead, he actually goes for the move bishop to f5. And this, again, is a very interesting choice. Now here, this line for black has been under a cloud ever since the very famous game Magnus Carlsen versus Vladimir Kramnik, where he showed a very interesting idea for white based on queen to f3, forcing bishop g6, then bishop takes, and g takes, and then here in this position with double pawns on the f-file after g takes f6, Magnus Carlsen did show against Vladimir Kramnik that white has very good long-term chances based on ideas like knight to f3, knight h4, knight e2, knight g3, knight to f5, and so on, dancing around with those knights. But instead, in the game, Arjun, he's a very aggressive player. He wants to keep those queens on the board, so with that in mind, he does go knight g to e2, just developing the knight on the e2 square, opting not to go for that queen to f3 idea. And here, black, he is not being punished for his very provocative move, bishop f5. He won't have those double pawns on the f-file, and black will be relatively okay. Now here, Magnus, in this position, the main idea is knight b to d7. This is the benefit of going bishop f5 first. You have the bishop outside the knight, therefore the knight does not block in the bishop on c8. But instead, in the game, Magnus, once again, he plays by his own rules. He does go bishop d6 here, and this move is a little bit weaker. Here, Arjun does find the right continuation. He starts knight to g3, driving back that bishop. And now, typically, in these lines, with the knight on g3, pressuring that bishop on g5, you do want to go bishop e6. The computers do show it is typically better to have that bishop centralized rather than on g6. However, here, bishop e6 would be a massive mistake, as the move knight to h5 puts pressure on that pawn on g7 and the knight on f6. You are threatening ideas like knight takes f6, doubling black's pawns, as of course, both the bishop and the knight are attacking it. Therefore, here, bishop e6 is not a good idea, and instead, bishop g6 was played in the game by Magnus. Now here, Arjun, the main line for him, or the strongest move, would be just bishop d3. Again, you are forcing that bishop on g6 to waste tempo. Then you just go bishop d3, offering the bishop trade, and you would have an excellent game. But again, Arjun, he's trying to keep as many pieces on the board as he can. He loves a complicated attacking game, and instead he does go queen to f3, developing the queen on the king side, and now the threat is knight to f5, again pressuring that bishop on d6 and that undefended pawn on g7. Now here, Magnus, he's not phased. He just goes knight b to d7, continuing his development on the queen side. And now Arjun, of course, the whole idea of queen to f3 was knight to f5. So with that in mind, knight to f5 is played in the game. Now here, Magnus, of course, bishop takes f5 is virtually forced. The only other playable move is bishop f8, but that move does not make a good impression. You retreat the bishop just to defend g7. That'd be very, very passive, especially in a blitz game. So bishop takes f5 was played in the game. Now we have queen takes f5, and now here, Magnus, this is a very important position in this middle game. Here, Magnus has the very strong idea of queen to a5 in the spirit of the Cambridge Springs variation of the semi-Slav. Now, the idea is the knight on f6 is defended by the other knight on d7. Therefore, you can swing out the queen without worrying about your pawns being doubled and so on. And from there, after queen to a5, you are threatening the idea of knight to e4, putting pressure on that bishop and that knight on c3. And of course, beyond that, ideas like h6 and g5 in the spirit of the Rogozin variation of the QGD are also possible, putting pressure on that bishop. So overall, queen to a5 would have been a very stylistic and very strong move. But instead here, Magnus, he does go h6, a simple move, driving back the bishop. Bishop goes to h4. And now again, queen to a5 is technically possible, but it is a little bit weaker here, as after a future queen a5, then knight e4, that bishop on g5 won't be attacked by the knight on e4. The bishop would be safe on h4. Therefore, queen to a5 does lose a little bit of its appeal. Now, beyond that, what else can black do here? Well, castling is perfectly fine, and you can also go, say, queen e7 or queen c7, intending long castles. But of course, instead of those options, in the game, Magnus did go g6, putting some pressure on that queen on f5. The queen must move now. Where's it going to go? In the game, Arjun does go queen to c2, flying back with the queen. And again here, Magnus has many different options. For example, g5 is fine, short castles is fine, and beyond that, the move he played in the game, queen e7, also very good. A typical Magnus move, very flexible, maintaining literally every option. g5, short castles, and long castles are all playable on the next move. So, as usual for his games, Magnus finding the most flexible option in this position. Now Arjun, bishop d3 is the move, developing his kingside. Now he is ready for either short castles or long castles, depending on what he wants to do. Now again, Magnus, he has the option of short castles or long castles, but he delays it one more move. Instead, g5 is the idea, driving back the bishop, then bishop g3, and then bishop takes and h takes is the sequence, and only now does Magnus castle, and he does castle on the queen side. So long castles on the board, this is the strongest idea here. And of course, the idea being, it is very difficult for white to attack the queen side. For example, after king b8 and maybe rook c8 in the future, the queen side will be relatively well defended. And here Arjun, he's just very slow to attack. And beyond that, if Arjun does castle on the king side, for example, short castles, then Magnus will have the very simple attacking plan of h5, then h4, potentially opening up the h-file by driving down that alpha 0 h-pawn down the board, or the ginger GM h-pawn, as I've been corrected in the comment section, but I like alpha 0 h-pawn better personally. Now here, Arjun, of course, the main idea is to get the attack going on the queen side. So here, rook b1 is the move, and beyond that, you could have also gone b4 immediately, as that pawn on b4, it would not be a good idea for Magnus to take it with queen takes b4. After rook b1, the rook would be very active on the open b-file, but instead, rook b1 immediately played by Arjun. And now here, Magnus feeling the pressure, he does go king to b8, a very simple prophylactic move. The idea being, he is ready for rook to c8 in the future. Now, that may be a very important resource for Magnus. For example, if Arjun does go b4, then b5 at some point, Magnus will have the option of either going, c takes b4 or even c5 with the rook on c8, and the rook would be lining up with the white queen. So, king b8, a very good flexible move by Magnus. Now here Arjun, b4, the obvious follow-up, and Magnus does get his attack on the king side, h5. Now technically Arjun is not castled yet. He has not short castled yet in this position. However, regardless, it is a very good idea to get the attack going as soon as you can. That way, if Magnus does ever go there in the future, you are ready. And beyond that, even if Magnus doesn't castle, just by opening up the king side, the white king will be a lot less safe. And overall, this is Magnus Carlsen's main source of counterplay here in this position. Of course, he has to do something. He can't just wait while Arjun builds up the attack with, say, knight a4, knight c5, a4, a5, or b5, and so on. Now here, Arjun, what should he be doing right here? Well, b5 is the first move you must check, but it turns out that move doesn't work. Then c5 is incredibly strong for Magnus. Again, the c-file would be opened up to his benefit. Rook c8 would be coming, and Magnus would be just fine. Now, instead of that here, Arjun, he knows that. He goes knight to a4, intending knight to c5, and then maybe a4, a5, a6, pushing the alpha 0 a-pawn down the board. Now here, Magnus, the move is rook to c8, a very good defensive move. Again, prophylaxis against a future b5 break. If b5 now, then c takes b5, wins the pawn, with the gain of tempo on the queen by the rook. That would not be good. So here, of course, Arjun, he can't do that. Now, in the game, Arjun did go knight to c5. However, the computer does like the idea of bishop f5, putting pressure on the knight and the rook across this diagonal. And of course, with those pawns on the g5 and h5 squares, that bishop really can't be challenged in the future. So overall, bishop f5 would have been a very interesting resource for Arjun. But instead of that here, knight to c5 was played in the game. Now, Magnus, in this position, the computer loves the idea of knight takes c5, but that move, personally, it doesn't sit well with me. After knight takes, then b takes, Arjun would have the very simple attacking plan of a4, a5, a6, again driving down that alpha 0 a pawn down the board. I personally would not want to be facing that as black. So here, Magnus, with that in mind, he does just go rook c7, a more flexible defensive move. Now, according to the engine, not quite as strong. The eval bar is jumping up a little bit, but overall, definitely a more human-looking move. Now, Arjun, a4 on the board, again, driving that the a pawn down the board. And now Magnus, he does the same on the opposite side of the board. h4, driving the alpha 0 h pawn to the h4 square, threatening ideas like potentially h takes g3 in the future. Now, of course, you can't do that immediately. The rook on h8 would hang, but after some preparation, that could be a very dangerous idea. Now here, Arjun, how should he follow up? Well, it turns out b5 is not the right idea. For example, after b5, c takes, then after either a takes or rook takes, knight takes c5 would be opening up the c file to Magnus Carlsen's benefit. So with that in mind here, the attacking plan is pushing the alpha 0 a pawn all the way down the board. So a5 is the move, threatening a6. That would be quite dangerous. And then after a6, after either b takes or b6, this c pawn would be a lot weaker, and here Arjun would have very good attacking chances. Now, in the game, Magnus, it's actually quite difficult to find a good idea right here in this position. Peter gives a lot of ideas, but they're not very attractive to a human player. Now, instead in the game, Magnus, he does go queen to f8, a typical Magnus move, retreating the queen, but there is an idea. Now, of course, h takes g3 is a threat, as the rook on h8 is defended, and after you take that g-pawn, then after rook takes, the queen can recapture on the h8 square. So, a flexible move with a very good idea behind it. Now, Arjun, he does take on h4, g takes h4, that is the strongest idea. Again, you cannot allow h takes g3, that would be just too scary. And now here after g takes h4, Magnus does recapture with the rook. So, rook takes, then rook takes and g takes, and now Magnus, his idea is potentially h3, again, trying to open up further lines on the king side. Now Arjun, he's not done attacking either. He goes a6. The alpha 0 a pawn has completed its journey. Now here, Magnus, of course, you cannot allow a takes b6. That would be devastating. So with that in mind, b6 is the move, driving back that knight on c5. Now here, of course, knight takes d7 is the move, jumping in with the knight. If you retreat back to, say, a4 or b3, that knight will be just too passive. So knight takes d7 on the board. Now knight takes and bishop f5, putting pressure on that knight on d7 once again. Now here, Magnus, knight to f6, redeveloping the knight back to the f6 square. And now here, Arjun, f3 is the move, guarding ideas like knight to e4. f3 does guard the e4 square for now. Now here, Magnus, queen g7, lining up the queen with that pawn on g2. Of course, queen takes g2 is not a threat yet, as the queen does defend, but Magnus here lining up additional threats in blitz time controls. Now here, Arjun, the move is bishop to h3, a very interesting move. The bishop is basically committing to this diagonal, but it does do a very good job of controlling this diagonal and the c8 square as well as g2. So the bishop, despite being somewhat awkwardly placed here, is actually doing a pretty decent job. And compared to the knight on f6, it is quite a bit more active, as that knight really isn't doing anything yet. Now here, queen g5 for Magnus, flying in with the queen, pressuring e3. Magnus is trying to fight back. And here, the most obvious move is king to f2. That king would be very well supported by those pawns on g2, f3, and e3. So, king g2, overall, a perfectly fine idea. But instead, Arjun, he does go rook to b3, defending that pawn on e3 with the rook. And this is the start of his problems. As you can see by the eval bar on the left collapsing, most of his advantage in this game did go away with this one tiny mistake. And now Magnus, he starts to turn up the pressure. Knight to e8, rerouting his knight to a better square. The idea being knight d6 and then knight c4, and c4 would be just a perfect square for the knight. Now here, Arjun, queen to f5. Sensing danger, he is trying to get those queens off the board, but Magnus does not mind. He is the greatest endgame player of all time after all. So, queen takes f5, then bishop takes, and then rook to e7, putting more pressure on that pawn on e3. This does restrict where the rook on b3 can go. For example, rook b2 or rook b1 are non-possibilities right now. All right, king to f2 for Arjun, a decent idea, but now knight to c7. Instead of going to d6, then c4, the knight goes to c7, pressuring that pawn on a6. And now Arjun, he may have to defend. In the game, he does go bishop d3, defending with the bishop. And this is a perfectly fine idea, but now Magnus, b5, blocking off the bishop. Now a6 is undefended. And here, believe it or not, the computer does say simply rook to a3 is the best idea. Now, that is a controversial decision, as in rook endgames, you typically want to have your rook as active as humanly possible. But here, that is the only way to defend the pawn, and it is the best move. Now, instead of that, Arjun, he did go rook to c3, simply ignoring the pawn on a6. The idea being, after knight takes, then you go rook takes c6. That was his idea, but it turns out that is not a very good idea at all. There is a major tactical problem with that sequence. Now here, Magnus, he does take on a6, knight takes a6, and he has quite a big advantage. And here, believe it or not, the best move is just rook b3, admitting your mistake, defending the pawn on b3 from the knight with your rook. Now, instead, Arjun, being the active player he is, he does take on c6, rook takes c6, but now Magnus, he just jumps in with the knight, gobbles at that b4 pawn, knight takes b4, of course, forking both the rook and the bishop. Therefore, rook to c3 is forced immediately, so rook c3 is the move. But now Magnus, rook c7, trying to trade off those rooks, that would be very, very bad. For example, those two passed pawns on the queen side, they would effectively decide the game. So with that in mind, here Arjun, he has to keep the rooks on the board. That is the only chance. As they say, all rook endgames are drawn, or at the very least, rook endgames tend to be a little more drawish than other endgames. So with that in mind, rook to b3 is the move, pressuring the knight. But here Magnus, he takes on d3, knight takes, and then rook takes. And by the way, the benefit of going rook c7 before taking on d3, here Magnus did get the extra move, rook to c7, in for free, essentially, compared to the other line. And now Magnus, he does push that b pawn down the board, b4. He knows passed pawns must be pushed. His plan is simple, literally just pushing these pawns down the board as far as they can go. I mean, you can't see up a square, but as far as they can go, and he's going to win the game. So Arjun, he tries to fight back, e4, trying to get a passed pawn of his own. But here Magnus, the finishing blow, rook c2 hits the king, king g1, the king being driven back to the first rank, and then simply a5. He ignores the threat of e takes d5, as with those two isolated pawns on the d file, the king going to say d7 could blockade them with zero issues. And here Magnus, his plan is simple. Again, pushing those two passed pawns down the board, there is literally nothing stopping them. And with that in mind, in this position, Arjun Erigaisi resigned on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and is simply unstoppable chess in this game. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Arjun Erigaisi in the 2024 Tata Steel India Tournament. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here of, again, Magnus and Arjun Erigaisi playing an incredible game at the 2024 Tata Steel India Tournament. If you enjoyed this game, I'm sure you'll love that one as well. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.